All right, hello everybody. Today we are going to be looking at nationalism and in particular nationalism in the Korean context. So when we think of nationalism, what is nationalism really? Um, it's this sentiment, or is it an ideology? Is it an understanding? Is it a cultural thing? So we're going to explore this notion of what nationalism is, how it is defined, how it is expressed, and how it is manifested in the Korean context. So, if we look at the dictionary definition of what nationalism is defined as loyalty and devotion to a nation, especially a sense of national consciousness, exalting one nation above all others, and placing primary emphasis on promotion of its culture and interests as opposed to those of other nations. So this is actually a really important point for us to understand when we go through this history of Korean nationalism, and for understanding how Korean nationalism has developed and evolved over time. Because this is a sense or a sentiment that is different from patriotism. Okay, so patriotism is just a feeling of love or pride in one's country. So as we can see here, a patriot or patriotism is about feeling this sense of unity and a shared sense of community with others in their region, and really supports their government or their political entity. Nationalism is something that is different. So as we can see here, the patriot is proud of his country for what it does, and the nationalist is proud of his country no matter what it does. So the patriot or patriotism is this love for country, whereas nationalism is always in comparison to something else, in comparison or in opposition to other countries or other nations, whereas patriotism is just, you just love your country or you just love your nation, and you think that your country or your nation is really great and you're proud of it. So this distinction is important here, and this sentiment of patriotism, where you love your country, this has been around for a really long time. In Korean, this term is called 애국, which is a term that combines the two characters for love and country. So it's literally a love of your country, and this term or this concept has been around for centuries in Korea and other parts of Asia. But the term nationalism or 민족주의 in Korean, this is a rather new or modern concept. And so it's important for us to make this distinction and to understand why this sense of nationalism has developed in the Korean context. So, when we think of Korean nationalism, there are many instances that we can give. There's the 2002 Asian World Cup, where Korea or South Korea performed very well, and we saw just hundreds of thousands of people gathering in Gwanghwamun to support the Korean team. and to urge them on to victory. We've seen it more recently with the candlelight vigils and this sense that okay, we need to change the country's leadership because it's going in the wrong direction. In North Korea, we also see this sense of nationalism. This is manifested in these kinds of military parades. There was actually just one recently, and it's a show of how not only how strong and developed the country is, but it is a show of power vis-a-vis other countries. So for the North Korean case, it's usually vis-a-vis the United States and vis-a-vis South Korea, and to a lesser extent maybe Japan. But it's about North Korea attempting to showcase that okay, we are strong enough to stand up to and to defend ourselves against the United States. But if we look at the historical origins of Korean nationalism, we have to go all the way back to the 19th century, the late 19th century. And you may recall from previous lectures that the late 19th century, this was a time when the Joseon dynasty had been opened up, and so there were all kinds of foreign influences coming into Korea. And as a result of this, all of these new concepts and simultaneously with Western imperialist powers encroaching on Korea and also pressure from Japan, the Koreans really started to feel this sense of having to reform the country in order to preserve their independence and their sovereignty. So we begin to see at the end of the 19th century a development of a modern nationalistic culture in Korea. And for example, there is the 독립신문, which is pictured here. This is the independent newspaper. And this newspaper was the first newspaper to be published purely in Hangul, in the Korean phonetic script. It was published in this script so that everybody could read it. So it was reaching out to a wide audience. It started publication on April 7th, 1896, and this newspaper started to explore ideas about what it means, what Korea was, and what it means to be Korean, and how to preserve Korean independence. Thus, why it was called the Independent newspaper. And the publishers of the Independent felt that the key to preserving sovereignty was education. And so the need thus to reach out to a wide audience and to encourage people to get involved in educational reform. The newspaper was published by the Independence Club, and the Independence Club had three goals, which was to protect Korea's independence, to promote self-strengthening, which means that they wanted to try to strengthen the country so that Korea could preserve their independence, and also to increase popular participation in the political process. So these were the goals of the Independence Club, and the Independent newspaper was a vehicle through which they were trying to accomplish these goals. So we see that at the end of the 19th century, we begin to have this consciousness, this nationalistic consciousness developing in Korea. But again, this is vis-a-vis other countries because there is this pressure from surrounding countries, whether it's Japan or Russia or these Western imperialist powers, that there's this pressure on Korea to do something in order to protect themselves. There were also other nationalistic movements that developed. This is particularly after the forced signing of the Protectorate Treaty in 1905. So with the Japanese coming and defeating Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, removing them as a competitor for hegemony on the Korean Peninsula, they then forced Korea to sign the Protectorate Treaty, which then took away all of Korea's ability to conduct diplomatic relations or to sign foreign treaties. So they couldn't negotiate with other countries. Any kind of negotiation or interaction with foreign countries had to be done now through Japan. And so this was just one step of stripping away Korea's power. And so there we see after 1905 this heightened sense of urgency and need to protect Korea and to try to do something so that Korea could maintain its sovereignty and independence. So in 1906, we saw something called the Korea Self-Strengthening Society that was created to try to help promote Korea to try to do various efforts to strengthen itself. In 1907, there was the Association for Redemption of the National Debt. So by this time, Korea had taken out substantial loans from Japan and owed Japan a lot of money. So this association was created to try to pay back this debt or pay back these loans to Japan, because they felt that by being financially indebted to Japan, that this undermined Korean sovereignty or Korean independence. So they encouraged women and girls to make hair ornaments and to donate the sales of those to this association. They encouraged men to stop smoking and to again donate their what they would have spent on tobacco and cigarettes to this association. Unfortunately, this did not really go anywhere because the Japanese accused this association or members of the association of embezzling money. There was also the New People's Movement, also created in 1907 to somehow try to organize members of the community and citizens to work for self-strengthening and for Korean independence. But none of these really were able to accomplish much. And for example, the New People's Movement was dissolved after Japan colonized Korea after 1910. So, but we do see that Koreans were trying to do something and created these associations. So then we get into the colonial period, and we have various efforts of Korean groups that are fighting against the Japanese and trying to reclaim and restore Korean independence. There were the righteous armies, the Uibyang. These were like small guerrilla units, and they would attack the Japanese. Usually they were based like in the mountains, so they would come down, they would attack the Japanese and then retreat back into the mountains. But they were rather small and scattered throughout the country, and they were poorly armed. The weapons that they used were rather outdated, and it was difficult to fight against newly modernized Japanese colonial army and police force that were very well equipped. And so um, the Japanese were able to drive out several of these righteous army groups, and many of them went up into Manchuria and would, come across the border or fight from there. So we have these types of groups, and then we have developing a more wider and broader sense of nationalism, particularly from the colonial period, and then brewing up until the end of World War One. So what had happened at the end of the First World War was that um, President Woodrow Wilson, he declared what was called the 14 points. So he was concerned with what was going to happen in Europe and after the First World War, and the breakup of the empires in Europe. So, for example, there was Austro-Hungarian Empire, and so instead of these empires being reformed or reassembled again, he wanted to urge that these conquered territories would be able to um, be ruled independently, and that they would have um, the independence of these former colonial territories. So he declares the 14 points. He declares the principle of self-determination, which means that these former colonized areas have the right for self-government and self-rule, and wanted to break up these old empires. So this is what he had in mind when he declared the 14 points. However, the Koreans, when they heard about this, they thought, okay, great, this applies to us, and perhaps the United States will then support us in Korea for our independence movement. But unfortunately, President Wilson was not thinking about Korea at all when he declared this. So in 1919, what we have is the March 1st movement, and this is considered to be the first nationwide mass nationalist movement in Korea, and the real first nationalist or first demonstration and manifestation of widespread Korean nationalism. So what had happened was the former king or emperor Gojong had died in January of 1919. And, being smack dab in the middle of the colonial period, the Japanese they did not allow Koreans to gather in large groups, but they decided to make an exception for the funeral of Gojong. So they said, okay, we're going to hold this funeral, the state funeral, and we will allow Koreans from all across the country to come to the capital to pay their respects to their former leader. And so the funeral was set to take place on March 3rd of 1919. So independence activists and leaders, they decided, okay, this is our moment. We're going to stage our independence movement and declare Korean independence at this time. But we're going to do this before the funeral. So as people are coming up to the Capitol and we have a large group assembled, this is when we're going to declare Korean independence. So they organized this for March 1st, 1919. The leaders, they assembled at a restaurant in downtown Seoul. They declared the independents of Korea called the police, were promptly arrested. But at the same time, we have in other parts of the country the Declaration of Korean Independence also being read. And what this did was it sparked a nationwide movement where we had eventually over 1 million Koreans participate in the independence movement. And this was truly a mass movement because we had men, women, young, old, um, upper class, lower class, just people of all walks of life that participated, and they all rallied and came together to support um, the the independence movement, and it was a peaceful movement. So they were unarmed, they were peaceful, they were just going to the streets and shouting "manse" for Korean independence. But unfortunately, this was just brutally squashed by the Japanese. What this did do was that it inspired other independence activities abroad. So in the same year, we had the Korean Provisional Government that was established in Shanghai. So this was a government to represent Korea because the state of Korea did not no longer existed since Japan had colonized Korea, but they created this, they established this provisional government to represent Korea. This was initially, it incorporated those on the political left and the political right, but eventually over time, it leaned conservative, and so it was taken over by the conservative right. Uh, we had Syngman Rhee, who participated in this provisional government, but he was based in the United States. So he had immigrated to the United States, had been educated there. He had married an American woman, and he became involved in independence activities in the United States. So he his his idea was that in order for Korea to regain its independence, they had to rely on a foreign power, and hopefully that foreign power would be the United States, and the United States would step in and help the Koreans. Another person based out of the U.S. was An Chang-ho, and his idea was that, all right, we want to regain our independence, but we're not quite ready for that yet. So we need to educate and prepare ourselves for independence first. And then lastly, there was Pang Yong-man, who said, forget all of this. This is not how we're going to regain our independence. The only way we're going to get it back is if we take it back by force. So he tried to establish an Air Force Academy, a military academy, one in Hastings, Nebraska, another in Sacramento, California. And he thought, if we develop a certain amount of military technology and a military force, then we can then take back our independence. Well, none of these ever were successful, and none of them were able to. They never succeeded in restoring independence to Korea, but at least they kept the hope of gaining independence alive. And then we also see that others based out of the United States were involved with really trying to organize and rally Koreans abroad. So Syngman Rhee and Philip Jason, who was actually Seo Jae-pil, but his English name was Philip Jason, they started organizing and coming together, and they organized the first Korean Congress in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in April of 1919. So this is obviously inspired by the March 1st movement, and so they hold this Korean Congress in Philadelphia. Philadelphia um, has symbolic meaning because this is considered to be the birthplace of American independence. So, um, hoping to be inspired by this, they organized and invited various Koreans from the United States and other American um, leaders, community leaders, to speak at this conference. And so this was all about coming together, trying to organize and have some kind of a formal organization for the pursuit of Korean independence. Um, Again, none of these were successful, and sort of um, faded over time. But in 1945, as we know, Japan surrenders, and this means that Korea's independence is restored after this. And so you can just imagine the feeling of excitement and joy that the Koreans had for gaining their independence. And so this is why we have immediately after efforts to establish their own independent government, which they did, and they called it the People's Republic of Korea. But this was not recognized by the U.S. Army military government in Korea. That ended up being the um, the leading organization in the southern half of the peninsula. So we have these efforts for independence again interrupted. So first by the Japanese, and then now by the Americans. And we know the story already about how this leads to the eventual division of Korea at the 30th parallel and the establishment of separate regimes, the South Korean government and the North Korean government in 1948, which then sets up the scene for civil war. And so we have the Korean War starting in 1950 and ending in 1953. So what we see developing during and after this is that while Syngman Rhee is in office as the first president of the Republic of Korea, particularly after the Korean War and as part of the general Cold War, there is this development of Korean nationalism in opposition to North Korea and communism in general. So there's this, particularly after 1953, when North Korea and South Korea, this is at the height of their animosity against each other. We have a South Korea that is being defined by what they are, and North Korea being the opposite of whatever South Korea is. And so, we've already discussed this in our ideas about North Korean communism and South Korean democracy, but these ideas are fueled by this sense of anti-communism and the greater Cold War ideology. So we see this developing and becoming more and more intense during Syngman Rhee's presidency. And we see that various political efforts and campaigns are fueled by this anti-communist, anti-North Korean ideology. So Syngman Rhee's justification for changing the constitution, for suppressing political opposition, for suppressing the student movement. This is all done in the name of protecting South Korea, Korean nationalism, and for the need to fight against North Korean communism and North Korean communists. So this is how this new Republic of Korea, South Korea, develops after Syngman Rhee, or during his presidency. It culminates with the April 1960 revolution. Because he had just pushed the limits too far, continued to change the constitution, remained as president for too long. Students finally rose up in anger, and it was violently suppressed by Syngman Rhee and these peaceful, unarmed students. Many of them were killed, and because of this, really, Syngman Rhee lost all legitimacy and credibility, and so he ended up resigning in 1960, and then about a year and a half later, there is a military coup d'etat where Park Geun-hye takes over as president, and so he is in office from 1961 to 1979, and he, being a military person, rules very heavy handedly, and it's during this time, as we've discussed in previous lectures, where we have this very strong economic drive and push for economic development. And again, this is done in the name of trying to develop the South Korean economy, strengthen the South Korean economy, bring it up to a level of where the North Koreans were, if not surpass the North Koreans, since the North Korean economy was doing much better than South Korea. So again, this is in opposition or in juxtaposition to North Korea. But again, Park Geun-hye utilizes anti-communist campaigns to fuel and inspire and mobilize the populace. And we see how this took place during the New Village movement, the Semaundong, where this is about mass mobilization for the good of the village, for the good of the country, and trying to build up the sense of South Korean nationalism to fuel economic development vis-a-vis North Korea. Again, this culminates in massive demonstrations and protests at the end of Park Geun-hye's presidency, many of them being violent and brutally suppressed by the army, but he is eventually assassinated by the head of his own Korean CIA, and then shortly thereafter we have yet another coup d'etat, which is staged by Chun Doo-hwan, another military figure, and he stays in office between 1980 to 1988. And again, this is a very heavy-handed type of rule, and we are at this time, coming towards the end of the Cold War, but still very much, in play and influencing what is going on in Korea, and a different kind of drive for economic development. This is also leading up to the '88 Olympics in Seoul, and this was really an opportunity for South Korea to put itself on the international map, so to speak, so that it could receive international recognition. This was a way for South Korea also to show up North Korea, because the North Koreans had been banned from previous Olympics. They had never hosted an Olympics before, and so this was a way for this was like South Korea's coming out party, and it was also a way for them to showcase themselves vis-a-vis Japan, because Japan at this point was an economic superpower, and um, South Korea was a rising economic superpower, but Japan had not hosted an Olympics for a while, and so this was a way for South Korea to really showcase themselves and show off what they had accomplished during this time. Um, and so again, this is vis-a-vis and in juxtaposition to North Korea and Japan. Chun Doo-hwan's presidency culminates with the Gwangju movement in 1980, where there are massive demonstrations against him. I'm sorry, his presidency starts off with the Gwangju demonstrations, which were again brutally suppressed, and then culminates with the 1987 demonstrations. And these demonstrations are what's featured in the film that I've asked you to watch. So 1987 is where we begin to really see just a nationwide, massive mobilization of everyday South Korean citizens that are protesting this authoritarian leadership. And this was significant because it's no longer led by the students, it's no longer led by intellectuals, but it is a movement that the majority of the population participated in. And so this is what really helps South Korea turn the corner when it comes to the democratization process. Here we see these massive demonstrations in front of City Hall, which is not unlike the kind of demonstrations that we saw in 2017 against the former President Park Geun-hye. And these are also demonstrations in front of the gate of Yonsei University. It was not uncommon at this time to feel this constant sting of tear gas. Especially around major universities such as Yonsei, because the student protests. But this then is what helps Korea to turn the corner. And then we saw many years later, in 2016, 2017, massive demonstrations again, and the candlelight vigils that occurred. And so we have people coming out en masse to express themselves politically, and eventually leading to the impeachment and removal from office of Park Geun-hye. Most recently, we have seen again South Koreans taking to the streets because of the dispute between Japan and South Korea, the trade disputes, but also disagreement over how to handle the comfort woman issue, and also the forced labor issues from the colonial period. And so again, we see South Koreans coming out en masse opposing Japan, encouraging Koreans to boycott Japanese products and Japanese stores. And so what we end up having now is this very long history of Korean nationalism going back to the late 19th century. And historically, Koreans had been denied a political voice. We do see it starting to develop at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, but from 1905 it is suppressed by the Japanese. And then again, after liberation, sort of suppressed or muffled by the Americans. And then after we have the establishment of the Republic of Korea and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, again, there is this suppression of political opposition by these authoritarian leaders, Syngman Rhee, Park Chung-hee, Chun Doo-won, etc. But very importantly, Korean nationalism is often defined and conceived of in terms of in opposition to other countries, namely North Korea and Japan. So this is very characteristic of South Korean nationalism, and we also see that South Korean nationalism is expressed often en masse in these massive large demonstrations. Partially this is because of its history, because Koreans have been denied a political voice, did not trust the political system. They felt that the most effective way that they could be heard was by taking to the streets and protesting in large numbers in the capital. So this is what we have seen. These are the historical origins and the development of Korean nationalism. So I will see you at discussion, and we will discuss these issues further.